Well, good morning, everybody, and welcome to this week's Keeping an Eye on the Geopolitical Ball with me, Jamie Shea, Senior Fellow at Friends of Europe. This will be the last eye before we have our summer break, but I hope to see all of you back faithfully with me in September. And for this last eye before the break, we decided today to do something different. And instead of listening to me, I hear a sigh of relief there. You'll have the pleasure of listening to one of my close colleagues at Friends of Europe, Chris Kremidas. Chris is also a senior fellow, and he specializes in hybrid warfare, disinformation, everything to do with resilience, among many other topics as well. And for the last few years, Chris has been organizing for Friends of Europe a tabletop exercise designed to test the resilience of Europe against a whole range of shocks and threats, some of them man-made, like cyber attacks and disinformation campaigns or deliberate sabotage, and some of them not man-made, particularly, for example, the COVID-19 pandemic that we've all been living through. We had our first TTX designed and prepared by Chris back in 2019, and then just a couple of weeks ago, we held another one, this time, as you can see from the report that has just come out, called Testing Resilience to Hybrid Threats, a real-time case study. I hope very much after today's eye, you'll all download this report, which is available from the Friends of Europe website. The details will be on the lower part of the screen as you watch this recording. And today I thought that it would be very appropriate to invite Chris to join me to talk a little bit about this tabletop exercise and what we learned in terms of lessons regarding our resilience, particularly since the last time we did this exercise in 2019, particularly what are the vulnerabilities that Chris still sees out there. Are we better prepared? Are we more able to respond than a couple of years ago? Are all of the key actors that need to work together effectively working together? So Chris, a warm welcome. And again, thanks for being with me today. And so the first question I would like to put to you is, what were the key challenges to resilience that you in particular as the exercise creator wanted to focus on?
Well, good morning, Jamie, and thank you for having me. What we wanted to focus on this time, as opposed to 2019. So in 2019, we wanted to do something that had never been done before, and that was an exercise with NATO, EU, and member states and the private sector. And we did that, and we learned a lot. And so this time around, we took a harder look at all of the above, plus local actors. We really rely on local actors. We talk about the strategic mayors who really make a difference in all their relationships within the local community. So we put an emphasis there. And within this scenario, we created a situation where the national governments and even all of Brussels really was leaning forward, relying on those local actors to sort of see how those relationships worked and how the connective tissue worked. So that was, this year it was still public-private, but with a very local flavor.
Okay, thank you very much. And the second thing I'd like to ask you concerns the private sector, because a key theme I know of the exercise was the need to have the private sector better involved in these kind of things. Is that because you see that the private sector isn't involved in the way that it should be? If so, why not? Why is it so important that the private sector play a role in resilience? Isn't that really something that governments need to do first and foremost themselves?
Well, in times past, governments could do most of it because they had control over most of the things we rely on. And so we're living in a very privatized age. And so the private sector are the first targets of a hybrid attack. And they're also the ones we rely on to restore our services like electricity, communications, or food supply, and so on. So building the connective tissue between the public and private sector is key to be prepared for these kind of crises. So, for example, if something happens with your transport system or the railroads or the electricity, government doesn't even know what's happening until the private sector tells them, or people tell them the lights are out. But so it's really, when you think about a society as a nervous system, the nerve endings are in the local community, among the people, and within entities that are controlled by the private sector. So if we have a problem, if there's an attack on a logistics system, it is private logistics companies who will tell us it's happening. So if we don't have that relationship, it's very difficult for governments to, number one, know what's happening, and number two, know what to do.
Okay, that sounds clear to me. Another thing that came out that really struck me reading the report is the way in which disinformation quickly breaks out when you have a major hybrid crisis, like we exercised in the TTX, and the way in which it can really disrupt the ability of government at all levels to handle the crisis. Can you say a little bit more about how you see disinformation playing this role? And as it's so universal these days, what can we do to better counter it?
Well, on one thing we highlighted and we saw within this exercise and in recent history is that the speed that's necessary to effectively respond to disinformation, and why governments and international organizations like the EU and NATO can struggle to keep up. Things are moving faster than before, and our institutions and processes don't always move fast enough to keep up with the speed of disinformation. And so one solution that a few of our disinformation expert participants offered up was to the idea of information first responders. So this would be a group of public, private, and civil society actors who can detect and address disinformation as soon as it emerges. Now, ideally, these would be local actors, since a number of studies have proven that local actors are more effective at countering disinformation. People you know, your doctor, your mayor, your neighbor, your plumber. You listen to the people who are in your life, the people you have that relationship with. And so how do we effectively empower information first responders? And then the other reason that local actors are so important is every year there's something called the Edelman Trust Barometer, where they do a big test of who's trusted, local governments or national, private sector, NGOs. And local governments eclipse national governments on trust on an average, about 9 to 11% in Europe. And so that's something to really take advantage of. You have to take advantage of those existing trust relationships. So the other idea that came out of this for disinformation was, we always talk about the damage to societies that disinformation is doing, but we never really measure it or take a look at what kind of damage. So one idea that came out was for periodic disinformation damage assessments to inform decision makers on where and how they can shore up societal cohesion and not allow disinformation to sort of flood the space. So those are really, we had a number of others that I would invite everyone to read in the report, but those are sort of two main ones.
Thanks, Chris. And it was good to see that the exercise was able to come up with some original ideas and some novel solutions there. That was all very interesting. You mentioned NATO and the EU in your last answer. And of course, they've always been the two big beasts of Brussels that both aspire to play a greater role in developing resilience. But how do you see the cooperation these days between these two organizations? Judging from the exercise, how good is it? Did you still pick up some possible areas for improvement there?
I say when it comes to NATO and EU cooperation during the pandemic, I think they learned to work even closer, and we saw that during the pandemic. So a lot of these discussions of duplication of effort, or countries asking maybe for the same thing of both houses, their level of coordination was so close that wasn't really a problem, and they did so because it was necessary. So what really forces processes, changes to processes like this in relationships is what did Anthony Eden say? Events, right? Events drive these things. So this event really drove them to see the necessity for this level of coordination. And I think when I look at NATO and the EU, I really look at two different nervous systems. So one, they have a lot of overlap, but one, the EU is really focused internally. They have a lot of internal ability to see what's happening internally and to act on what's happening internally. And NATO is more of the external nervous system. They can look in the broader world. They can still do some things internally, but that's their real strength, is looking in the external and acting external to our territories when it comes to hybrid threats. And so finding a way to take these two nervous systems and response capabilities more complementary is something they should continue to build on. And I think it's important in some respect, without getting into sort of division of labor type of things, there has to be a lot of overlap, because you get into supportive and supporting relationships depending on the situation. So I think I think they have a strong basis to grow from, but I think the pandemic only drew them closer together.
Yeah, and hopefully we created a sort of a confidential sort of Chatham House rules type of atmosphere where they could have that frank conversation. But that's an interesting analogy, the idea that they have sort of different but complementary nervous systems. Chris, moving to almost my two final questions. The last time you planned this type of exercise, 2019, already 2 years ago, we're now, of course, in 2021. Did you sort of detect that vis-a-vis 2019, things have moved on a little bit? Did you see improvements? You know, is everybody getting the message now? Or are there still sort of things that keep you awake at night?
Well, you know, Jamie, it's funny you should ask that because, you know, our 2019 tabletop exercise was conducted in November of 2019. We got the report out in about December. The clock ticks over to 2020, and very shortly we started, you know, we had a pandemic. And so, you know, the report came out just prior to the pandemic. And then we saw the EU, NATO, their member states get a mandatory governance examination on all of the lessons that we identified.
Indeed.
And, you know, and during that time, you think about the last 17, 18 months of our lives, we've had to deal with everything from public-private cooperation on out there, development and deployment of vaccines, the threat from a virus we didn't know much about, and we're still learning about, dealing with public trust during a crisis, trade disruption and border crossing issues, dealing with disinformation. And we've improved a lot in a number of these areas. But I think where we still have some gaps is on disinformation and building trust within societies. Not only within societies, but also that public-private. You know, saw some of the food fights between some of the institutions and the companies that were making vaccines, you know, and if they had a better public-private relationship going into that, you know, some of that might have been avoided. So absolutely. I think, you know, the public-private relationship and our speed of response to and effectiveness of response to disinformation are the two areas we still need a lot of work on.
Okay, Chris, thanks. Finally, and we're almost out of time, so I have to ask you for a very brief answer here. But the report, dear prospective readers, when you look at it, contains a number of very useful recommendations at the end. That's the whole point. But Chris, of those recommendations, which briefly would you think were the most important three that you would really like to highlight for us?
Well, thank you, Jamie. There's so many recommendations. You know, I'd invite everyone to read the report, but I'd say that the three that really come to mind are when it comes to public-private cooperation, it's about finding the right balance between regulation and incentives. So we find that there's a simultaneous need for effective regulation of some, you know, for example, social media companies and platforms, and incentives to encourage key industries to share information and participate in information sharing exercises so we can build those relationships. And one thing that was very clear in the exercise from our private sector participants was that a relationship with a regulator is not the same as a relationship with a partner. And the governments gain a lot more trust with industry using incentive structures than they do by compelling companies to share information. Right. So that said, you know, the business models of, for example, social media companies and the unique, you know, they present some unique vulnerabilities for us, and they've proven that they're not always as willing to, you know, they haven't been as willing to play along on the incentive side. So, you know, a number of the government actors really agreed that we need more effective regulation of social media activities. But, you know, the private sector, of course, not a monolith. There are quite a number of differences. Secondly, is a continued need not only for public-private exercises, but for public-private whole society risk assessments at the local, regional, and national level, and international levels. And in that process of doing those, we not only get a better picture of what the risks are, but we also build trust in the necessary connective tissue to enable more effective crisis response. So, you know, when we do this, we form these local, regional, and national whole society resilient sort of enterprise groups. And they can also work together to anticipate future challenges and conduct joint risk assessments, as I said. So finally, I would say the last big lesson, and I think the main lesson from this one, is that building trust relationships and mechanisms is something we need to do well before a crisis. So you can't really surge a relationship and you can't surge trust. And so it's critical to take the time to build those relationships now, early on, and break down those barriers instead of waiting until a crisis. Near the middle of the crisis is not the time to be building those relationships. So
time saves nine, as the old saying goes.
Exactly.
Chris, thanks very much indeed. Dear viewers, I hope that's whetted your appetite for reading the report, learning more about resilience. I'll invite Chris back periodically to give us resilience updates as we move forward. But for now, as always, thanks for listening and watching. Look forward to the resuming in September. Enjoy your summer break, everybody. Thank you again.